Hi, Tom here. In this week's Circle Line Article drawing, I'll show you one way to use one-point perspective to draw a road and a street scene with some telegraph poles and a view of Mount Fuji in the distance, all using a pencil and a pen. I would suggest you just use whatever pencil and pen you have at hand. To start your drawing at the beginning, draw a horizontal line using a soft pencil line slightly below the middle height of your paper. Next, draw a vanishing point in the center of this horizon line, and all receding lines will look like they go towards this one single vanishing point. The next step is to draw a line to the right base of your paper from the vanishing point, and then another line to the left base of your paper from the same vanishing point. Next, we can draw two more lines, one to the right and one to the left, but this time these are more guidelines, so they can be softer lines. Now we need to draw another guideline, a soft line, going up towards the left top page, and then we can sort of mark it across so that it's symmetrical and draw another line going to the right top page. Not right to the corner, but towards the corner. Next, between the two guidelines on the left, we can draw a vertical line, which will be for one of the telegraph poles which go along the road. Now we can use the guideline, which is at the top and the bottom of this first telegraph pole, to draw another telegraph pole, and then a series of telegraph poles beyond that, each one getting closer together to each other as they go further away from us and closer to the vanishing point on the horizon. Then on the left-hand side, we can draw another vertical line for the closest telegraph pole on the left-hand side. Next, I'd find it useful to draw a few dots from the left guideline to the right guideline, which sort of travel across horizontally. You could use a ruler, or you could just do it by eye, and this will mark out so that the telegraph poles on the right are in the same position, same distance away from us as the ones on the left. We could also mark the top of each telegraph pole, and these dots are just to guide us with our drawing. But as you're drawing, you might find that they're not 100% accurate. And then just draw a series of lines, vertical lines, between the two guidelines from dot to dot. Again, you could use a ruler, or you could just draw it freehand. And then we can finish off on the right with the closest telegraph pole on the right-hand side. So now we have a symmetrical drawing, a drawing which is the same on both sides of a series of telegraph poles going away into the distance. And then we can draw little ellipses at the base of each telegraph pole to show the thickness of them. And then next to each of the vertical lines, we can draw another vertical line to show the thickness of each telegraph pole. And because they're going away from us, they're getting smaller in height, but they're also getting narrower because they're further away. So the lines that you're drawing next to the first lines can get closer together as they go away towards the vanishing point. So on the right, we just do exactly the same as the process, the techniques that we used on the left. So now we've got the thickness of telegraph poles receding into the distance. I think I'll make the base front part of each ellipse of the telegraph poles a bit darker, and then we can add a little semicircle at the top of each one too. So now we've got these sort of very thin columns going away in one-point perspective. Behind the columns on the left, we can draw another line going to our vanishing point, a guideline, soft line. And this first line is below the horizon, And then we can draw another guideline, but this time the receding line is above the horizon, and they mark the base and the top of a row of buildings that we can draw, which are behind the telegraph poles on the left. And then we can mark out how wide each of these buildings are by drawing a series of vertical lines. And then the front-facing part of each of these buildings will be a rectangle, and the top and the bottom of each of these rectangles will be parallel to the horizon line and also parallel to the edge of your paper. We could also draw a series of doors and windows. Again, because they are behind the telegraph poles, we can draw them either side of the telegraph poles, and that sense of overlapping will also help the illusion of depth which we're trying to create in our drawing. So in this drawing we're using guidelines which are soft lines, but we're also using darker lines when we're more confident that the lines that we're drawing are going to stay where they are and they're going to be the same as the finished lines. We can always use guidelines going towards the vanishing point in the center for all of the receding lines, and all of the vertical lines in the whole drawing, all of them will stay vertical and all of the vertical lines are parallel to each other. But the receding lines are always going towards the vanishing point. If the receding line is near to the horizon line, it will almost be a horizontal line, but as receding lines become further away from the horizon line, they become at a greater angle. So for example, at the top of the telegraph poles, the angle of the line is very steep, whereas the angle of the line nearer the horizon is much less steep. So that the road is not a never-ending road, because we're going to draw a view of Mount Fuji in the distance, we can draw a building at the end of the road and then indicate a road which is very far away, which goes to the left and the right. Now the building needs to be just slightly lower than the horizon line, because the horizon line is so far away, we wouldn't really be able to see a building in any detail if it was actually on the horizon. Over time you could just develop more shapes in the buildings. So I think this first line of buildings on the left, I'll add another floor to the buildings, as it were, but this second floor of each of the buildings is back set a little bit, so the vertical lines are slightly behind the vertical lines on the ground floor, but the receding lines still go to the vanishing point, and the vertical lines still stay vertical. And in that way you can draw a ground floor building which has a first floor which is slightly receding from the front of the ground floor. And then we could even draw a third floor structure on some of the buildings as well. Remember to use the fact that the telegraph poles are in the foreground, so the buildings are always behind them. So any chance you get to make a shape or a detail which goes behind the telegraph poles, that will heighten the sense of depth in your drawing. Now, as I'm drawing this, I'm thinking that these shapes are going to repeat on the right-hand side. And then when you're ready, we could start to add, in exactly the same way, a series of buildings on the right-hand side. They don't need to be totally symmetrical, but it would be useful, I think, to use a guideline going to the horizon and the vanishing point on the horizon. And this guideline will show us where the top and base of the beginnings of each of the buildings are. And when using 1-point perspective, the horizontal lines stay horizontal. And again, we're using this fact of the telegraph poles being in front and the buildings being behind. So think about the height of each building and how it relates to the other buildings in your drawing. So the front-facing side of each of these buildings is basically a rectangle, but it might be hidden by the fact that there's a building in front of it or a telegraph pole in front of it. And then the vertical lines stay vertical, and try to also think about the gaps in between the buildings so that there could be a road in between the gaps or people could walk in between the gaps. When drawing perspective, it's useful not just to think about the shapes that you're drawing in perspective, but the gaps in between the shapes that you're drawing in perspective are also very useful. If you'd like to learn more about how to draw, starting from scratch, or how to draw buildings in greater detail, please consider joining one of my online drawing courses. You can find more details at circlelineartschool.com. So for the next step in this drawing, we could draw a line down the middle of the road. In fact, it would be best to draw 2 lines, and that would be the thickness of one line, but shown as 2 lines, going to the vanishing point in the center of the horizon line that we drew at the very beginning. And then you might like to make these lines darker or split them up into larger parts in the foreground, getting to small parts in the background. Once you've got a central line to the road of your drawing, we could perhaps add a thickness to the pavement either side of the road by adding a few more lines going to the vanishing point, and then we can show these lines as thicknesses by adding a series of short vertical lines that are getting closer together as they go towards the vanishing point on the right and on the left. Once you've added a few more details, I think it would be time to work back into the telegraph poles by drawing a horizontal line coming off each of the telegraph poles. But to do that, we need a guideline going to the vanishing point first. So the guideline on the left, and then another guideline which is just a soft line on the right. And then from that, we can draw horizontal lines which are going towards the center of the road on each of the telegraph poles. Whenever you see a space and you think that some extension or addition to the architecture that you've drawn would fit in, then I suggest you just draw whatever you like. Once you get an idea of something, just go for it and draw it and see how it looks. If you draw something that doesn't quite work, I tend to find that just by continuing drawing, you can sort it out rather than erasing it. Just see if you could add something else to make it work better. So there are lots of very small, well, they're not small buildings, but lots of buildings in the distance that look small because they're in the distance. Once you've got to a stage where you're content that you've got a road with telegraph poles in 1-point perspective and some details on the buildings on the left and the right, then you could use a black pen to go over the pencil lines that you've been drawing. It's just an idea. If you want to do this and you have a variety of different black pens, it might be useful to have some black pens which are slightly thicker lines, and they could be used for the shapes which are in the foreground of your drawing. And then if you've got any black pens which make a thinner line, they'd be much more useful for the shapes in the distance and far distance of your drawing. Because they're thinner lines, the lines will just naturally look like they're further away because they're thinner, whereas the lines using a pen which is thicker will look like they're closer to us. And then with the shapes which are really close to us, we could double up the line even thicker by going over it twice. Because you can't change any of the marks that you do with a pen, you do need to concentrate even more than when we were just doing the lines at the beginning. But I think that, generally speaking, there's always a way to improve something if it goes wrong. Once you've done the first few lines in the drawing, it's basically just building up more and more structure and more ideas about what you want to achieve in your drawing. And if something isn't quite right, you can probably just add something else to make it work better. When you're ready and you think that the pen work is working okay and you've got the level of detail that you think is right for the drawing that you're making, you could start to consider to add some of the wires that go between the poles of the telegraph poles, which are going away from us in 1 point perspective. Now, to do this, it would be best to use the thinnest black pen that you have, or a very sharp, hard pencil, so that the lines are very thin. I think it just is generally in drawings, if you just draw as if it's working, it's a lot easier to just play around and create the shapes which are needed for the drawing. So I think on the right, I could draw another telegraph pole sort of separately on the right. It would sort of make sense. If you draw thinking it's going to go wrong, it probably will go wrong. But if you can just be a little bit more playful and experimental with some of the lines that you make, then you'll probably find that the lines that you make have more confidence in them and therefore are more useful for the drawing that you're creating. So we could keep adding more of the wires to the telegraph poles, remembering that things get smaller as they go further away, and there are bigger shapes as they come towards us, as they're nearer towards us. Once you've finished this step, the next step would be perhaps to add a few more details with pen work, and then we can think about adding the mountain, Mount Fuji, in the distance, in the far distance of our drawing. To add the image of Mount Fuji, start at the top of the mountain, which is an old volcano, and then from there we can draw a gliding line, as it were, to the left, and then another gliding line which goes behind the telegraph poles and behind the buildings to the right. Then we can split up the mountain with a sort of scratchy line zigzagging backwards and forwards. And this line represents the edge between the light side of the mountain and the dark side of the mountain. And I think that I'll make the dark side of the mountain on the right. Sometimes it's tempting to put too many details, but I think the main thing with this drawing is that the details that we're putting in, it's a really large mountain in the distance, but the lines that we're using need to be really thin. Once you've got the mountain in place, we could draw a few perhaps extra shapes in the foreground as well. Then we could think about perhaps using a pencil and adding some shading to the drawing. To do this, I'll use just a 4B pencil, I think, and put some tone on the right-hand side of some of the buildings. It's generally a good idea when drawing with tone to do a little bit less than you think at first, because you can always add more later on. And they might be higher contrast, be darker as they are closer towards us. By drawing things step by step and starting with basic shapes and then going into details later on, and then adding basic tones, and then perhaps adding some tonal details later on, then we can, by using these basic techniques and basic structure, we can create an image which is quite complicated, but it's actually made out of a few basic steps. So the last thing in this drawing will just be to add some tones to the base of the telegraph poles, shadows going towards the right, cast shadows going towards the right, for the telegraph poles on the right, but also for the telegraph poles on the left. And then the buildings on the left will also have cast shadows to them. Next, we can add some tone to the actual Mount Fuji. We could speed up this sketching a little bit now, just with the side of a pencil, blocking in a mid-tone, a tone which is not quite dark and not quite light, but something in the middle. And then we can look at the drawing and think about what it needs next. And within Mount Fuji, we could just make a few areas even darker than the mid-tone that we have. And then behind Mount Fuji in the sky, I don't really want to put any clouds or anything because that would make it too busy. I want it quite quiet. So I'll just change the tone behind the mountain on the left and the right using a very soft tone with the side of the pencil, so that the sky becomes a slight tone, and that will make the snow side of Mount Fuji seem brighter. So by smudging some of the other areas of the drawing and leaving the left-hand side of the mountain as white as the paper was and is, that white paper looks brighter because virtually everything else in the drawing has got a slight tone to it. So if you'd like to learn more about drawing, particularly drawing buildings in perspective, please visit my Circle Line Art School website at circlelineartschool.com. Thanks very much for watching. I post a new video every week on my YouTube channel. I hope you also subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you can keep up to date with all the content that I'm making. Thanks for watching and see you next time.